There is a story everyone seems to agree on right now. Artificial intelligence will make the economy more efficient. It will automate tedious work, compress costs, and eventually make goods and services cheaper across the board. It's the same story told about the personal computer, about the internet, about cloud computing. New technology arrives expensive and specialized, then gradually becomes cheap and universal. This video is going to argue something uncomfortable. Before any of that happens, AI may first become one of the largest inflationary forces in the modern economy. Not because the technology is flawed, but because building it requires resources the physical world simply cannot produce fast enough. And underneath that inflationary pressure sits something even less discussed. One of the core assumptions holding up hundreds of billions of dollars in AI investment, the belief that American companies would permanently dominate this technology, has quietly started to weaken. This isn't a story about whether AI is good or bad. It's a story about what happens when a trillion-dollar bet rests on a belief, and that belief starts to wobble. Chapter 1. Why everyone believes AI makes things cheaper. To understand why this moment is so strange, you have to understand why the opposite assumption became so widely accepted in the first place. Economists have a fairly reliable template for how transformative technology behaves over time. It starts concentrated, expensive, and difficult to access. Then, as adoption spreads and production scales, costs fall dramatically. Computing itself is the textbook example. In 1956, a single gigabyte of hard drive storage cost roughly $10 million. Today, that same gigabyte costs a fraction of a cent. The personal computer followed a similar arc, moving from a room-sized machine only governments and universities could afford to a device sitting in nearly every home on Earth. Cloud computing extended that same story into the 2010s. Renting server capacity from Amazon or Microsoft became so inexpensive that starting a software company no longer required buying your own servers at all. The cost of entry collapsed. AI looked, on paper, like the next installment of this pattern. A tool capable of writing code, drafting documents, analyzing data, and answering customer questions, all without adding headcount. If that held true at scale, the effect on the broader economy really could have been meaningfully deflationary. Less labor costs embedded in everything from customer service to software development to basic administrative work. Several major financial institutions published research over the past 2 years modeling exactly this outcome, projecting that widespread AI adoption could shave measurable percentage points off long-term inflation, simply by making entire categories of labor more efficient. That was the story. It made intuitive sense. It fit a pattern investors had seen before. But that story rested on one quiet assumption nobody examined closely enough. It assumed AI itself would stay cheap to build and cheap to run, and that assumption has not held. Chapter 2. The hidden cost underneath the chatbot. To see why, you have to stop thinking about AI as software and start thinking about it as a physical industrial process, because that's what it actually is. Start with electricity, since that's where the story genuinely begins. Training a single large frontier AI model can consume roughly the same amount of electricity as tens of thousands of American homes use in an entire year. That's before the model is ever released to the public. Once it is, every single query sent to it draws additional power. By several independent estimates, a single AI query can use somewhere around 10 times more electricity than a standard web search. Multiply that by the billions of daily queries flowing through a handful of major AI platforms, and the scale becomes difficult to overstate. This demand has to physically go somewhere, and it goes into data centers, purpose-built industrial facilities that didn't exist at this scale a decade ago. Some of the newest AI-focused data center campuses now under construction require as much continuous electricity as a mid-sized American city, drawing power 24 hours a day, every day of the year, indefinitely. Here is the problem. The American electrical grid was not designed for this. Building new power generation capacity or meaningfully upgrading the transmission infrastructure needed to move that power is not a fast process. It typically takes utility companies somewhere between 5 and 10 years to plan, permit, and construct new large-scale power capacity. AI data center demand did not arrive on that timeline. It arrived in a matter of quarters, not decades. The result has been a genuine bottleneck. Utility regulators in several states have publicly acknowledged delaying other planned infrastructure projects specifically to accommodate data center power requests. Some data center developers, unwilling to wait for the public grid to catch up, have begun pursuing entirely separate solutions, proposing dedicated natural gas plants built specifically to serve a single data center campus. Perhaps the clearest signal of how serious this has become is what's happening with nuclear power. For decades, nuclear energy was treated in the United States as a declining industry, too expensive, too politically fraught, too slow to build. In just the past 2 years, several major technology companies have signed agreements to restart previously decommissioned nuclear reactors, paying a significant premium specifically to secure guaranteed, uninterrupted electricity. Think about what that actually represents. An industry considered economically unviable for a generation is being revived, not through government policy, but because private companies are willing to pay whatever it costs for reliable power. That new demand doesn't stay contained to data centers either. In regions with heavy data center construction, ordinary households and small businesses share the same regional electrical grid, and in several of those regions, electricity rates have already begun climbing measurably faster than the national average. A household doesn't need to use a single AI product to feel this. They simply need to live near the infrastructure now being built to power it. Electricity is only the first input, though. The second is the physical hardware itself, and this bottleneck is arguably even tighter. Modern AI systems depend on a specialized category of memory chip called HBM, high bandwidth memory. Ordinary memory chips, the kind inside a standard laptop, simply cannot move data fast enough to keep pace with the processors used to train and run large AI models. A useful way to think about the difference is a road system. Standard memory functions like an ordinary 2-lane street, perfectly adequate for typical daily traffic. HBM functions more like a 12-lane highway, purpose-built to move an overwhelming volume of information without creating a bottleneck. Without that highway, an extremely expensive AI processor simply sits idle, waiting for data. Only a small handful of companies in the world are capable of manufacturing HBM at meaningful scale. SK Hynix, Micron, and Samsung together control the overwhelming majority of global production capacity. As AI demand accelerated, all three companies began redirecting production away from standard consumer memory chips, the kind used in ordinary laptops and phones, toward the far more profitable AI-specific memory instead. This is simple economics. If the exact same factory floor space generates dramatically higher profit margins producing AI memory, capital naturally flows in that direction. That redirection created a genuine shortage in ordinary consumer memory chips, and prices across consumer electronics have risen sharply as a result, in some cases more than doubling within a matter of months. This is part of why several major electronics manufacturers took the unusual step of raising prices on existing consumer products mid-year, something companies rarely do outside of a new product launch. The products themselves hadn't changed. The cost of a single internal component simply had. Then there's the human cost, which may be the least visible but most economically revealing piece of this entire puzzle. The number of engineers in the world with genuine, hands-on expertise in training frontier AI systems is remarkably small, likely numbering in the low thousands globally. Every major AI lab on Earth is competing for essentially the same narrow pool of talent. That scarcity has pushed compensation for senior AI researchers to levels that would have seemed implausible in almost any other engineering discipline just a few years earlier. Multiple reports over the past year have described individual signing bonuses, before any base salary or equity, reaching 8 figures for a single researcher moving between competing labs. Companies aren't only competing on salary either. They're increasingly competing on access to computing resources themselves, since a researcher's productivity is directly tied to how much processing power they have available to run experiments. In some cases, engineers have reportedly chosen lower total compensation at one company specifically because that company offered dramatically more computing access to actually do meaningful research. Layer all of this together, and a clear picture emerges. Electricity, specialized chips, and elite engineering talent, the three foundational inputs AI genuinely depends on, have all become significantly more expensive as demand accelerated. None of them have gotten cheaper. If anything, each one has moved firmly in the opposite direction. Chapter 3. The assumption quietly starting to crack. All of this spending, the data centers, the chips, the nuclear power agreements, the extraordinary salaries, rests on a foundational belief that justifies the enormous expense. That belief is that the companies making these investments will eventually dominate a market so valuable, so essential to the future economy that today's spending will look modest in hindsight. Embedded inside that belief is a more specific, more fragile assumption. That frontier artificial intelligence will remain something only a small handful of extraordinarily well-funded American companies can produce. That specific assumption has started to weaken, and it happened faster than most of the industry expected. Over the past year, Chinese AI labs have released a series of open-source models capable of matching, or in some benchmarks closely approaching, the performance of leading American systems, while costing a small fraction to build and operate. One widely cited comparison found that running an identical coding task through a leading American model and a competing Chinese open-source model produced comparable results at roughly 1/7 to 1/12 the cost. The mechanism behind this cost difference matters because it directly challenges the core justification for massive frontier spending. Building a genuinely new frontier AI model from scratch requires an enormous amount of original computational research run through trial and error at extraordinary expense. But there is a considerably cheaper alternative, known as distillation, where a smaller model is trained by studying the outputs of an existing, already built model, effectively learning a compressed version of what that larger model already knows. Chinese AI labs have become remarkably efficient at this technique, then releasing the resulting models publicly, free for anyone in the world to download and modify. In effect, every dollar spent building an original frontier model indirectly subsidizes cheaper, competitive alternatives elsewhere. This has produced a genuinely unusual outcome. Companies with no specific AI pedigree at all, including at least one Chinese company built originally around food delivery logistics, have released AI models capable of competing credibly against systems built by some of the most well-funded technology companies in America. At the same time, a separate but related shift has been unfolding in Europe. Several governments have begun actively discussing the development of sovereign AI infrastructure, systems built, trained, and hosted entirely within their own borders, explicitly to reduce long-term dependence on American technology providers. This isn't primarily a story about politics, it's a story about risk management. Relying entirely on a small number of foreign companies for a technology increasingly considered critical infrastructure carries genuine strategic exposure, and several governments have begun treating that exposure seriously. None of this means American AI companies are suddenly falling behind in absolute terms. The most capable individual models available today do still, by most measures, come from American labs. That was never really the assumption underpinning hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending. The assumption was closer to permanent, structural dominance, a moat wide enough that no other country or company could meaningfully compete for years, perhaps decades. That specific assumption, the one justifying the scale of current spending rather than simply justifying the technology's existence, is the one now facing real documented pressure. Chapter 4. What history actually teaches about bubbles. To understand why this matters so much, it helps to step back from AI entirely and look at how financial bubbles have historically behaved, because the pattern is more consistent than most people realize. In the 1840s, Britain experienced what's now called railway mania. Investors poured money into hundreds of competing railway companies, convinced that rail transport represented the permanent future of commerce and travel. Parliament authorized construction of nearly 9,500 miles of track. Roughly a third of that authorized track was never actually built. The railways themselves turned out to be genuinely transformative technology. The specific companies and valuations built around them mostly collapsed anyway, because the pace of investment had outrun the pace of real, sustainable demand. A more recent example arrived at the end of the 1990s, during the build-out of long-distance fiber optic cable. Telecommunications companies, convinced that internet traffic would double every few months indefinitely, spent more than $500 billion laying fiber optic cable across the United States in just a few years. By the early 2000s, Independent estimates suggest that as little as 3% of all installed fiber optic cable was actually being used to carry data. The rest sat dormant underground. The technology itself was completely real and would eventually prove essential. That same buried fiber quietly became the physical backbone of streaming video, cloud computing, and modern internet infrastructure, once genuine demand finally caught up years later. But in the short term, dozens of companies that built that infrastructure collapsed entirely, wiping out roughly $2 trillion in market value. The common thread across virtually every historical bubble isn't that the underlying technology was fake or worthless. Railroads were real. The internet was real. Housing as an asset class was real. In every case, the technology or asset eventually proved to be exactly as transformative as its early believers claimed. What actually collapsed each time was a specific narrative about scale, timing, and who would ultimately capture the value. Prices and investment levels weren't built on the technology itself. They were built on a story about the technology, and stories can lose credibility long before the underlying facts on the ground actually change. That distinction matters enormously here. Bubbles rarely burst because capital physically runs out. They burst because the story investors were relying on to justify current prices stops being believed even if the technology underneath continues to genuinely improve. Chapter 5. What happens if the story stops being believed? This is where the AI story becomes genuinely worth watching closely, not because a collapse is guaranteed, but because the mechanism for how it could unfold is already visible in the data. Right now, capital expenditure on AI infrastructure represents one of the single largest categories of corporate spending among major technology companies, collectively running into the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. A meaningful and growing share of that spending is being funded not through existing profits, but through freshly issued corporate debt. If the narrative justifying that spending begins to weaken, whether through slower revenue growth than promised, increased competition from cheaper alternatives, or simply investor fatigue, the first visible sign typically isn't a dramatic crash. It's usually something far quieter. A single major technology company on a single quarterly earnings call mentioning that it plans to moderate the pace of its infrastructure spending going forward. That single statement tends to matter disproportionately because it functions as public permission for every other company facing the same competitive pressure to do the same thing without appearing weak by comparison. If capital expenditure genuinely begins slowing across the industry, the downstream effects ripple outward in a fairly predictable sequence. Demand for the specialized chips currently in short supply eases, easing upward pressure on memory prices. Cloud computing expansion slows as fewer new data centers get commissioned. Some of the electricity generation projects currently being built or planned, including those restarted nuclear facilities, risk becoming what analysts call stranded assets, expensive infrastructure built for demand that arrives later than expected, or in smaller volume than originally projected. Valuation multiples across AI-related companies would likely compress as well, not necessarily because underlying revenue disappears, but because the market's assumptions about future growth get recalibrated to something more conservative. None of this requires AI itself to fail as a technology. Companies during the fiber optic build-out weren't wrong that the internet would eventually matter enormously. They were wrong about the specific pace, the specific scale, and precisely which companies would ultimately capture that value. The genuinely difficult question sitting underneath all of this is not whether artificial intelligence will meaningfully reshape the global economy. The available evidence increasingly suggests it will, in ways that are already measurable today. The hard question is whether today's valuations and today's extraordinary pace of infrastructure spending already assume a specific future. One where a small handful of companies achieve durable, structural dominance over a technology that increasingly appears far more replicable and far less exclusively American than that spending currently assumes. That question doesn't have a clean, satisfying answer yet. But it's the question worth sitting with long after the excitement around any single new model release has faded.